The morning sun cast long shadows across the Morrison ranch as Jake Morrison rode through the gates with a cargo he'd never wanted to carry. Behind him, tied to his saddle with rough hemp rope, walked a young woman whose tear-stained face told a story of broken promises and shattered dreams. Her white cotton dress, once pristine, was now dusty and torn, and iron shackles around her wrists caught the early light like accusations against his soul. Jake Morrison wasn't a cruel man, but debt collection in 1880s Texas didn't leave much room for kindness. What he hadn't counted on was his 6-year-old daughter Ellie, waiting on the front porch, her blonde curls catching the morning breeze, and her innocent blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene unfolding before her. "Daddy!" Ellie called out, running toward his horse with the fearless enthusiasm that only children possessed. But as she got closer, her steps slowed, her smile fading as she noticed the woman walking behind her father's horse. "Daddy, why is she crying?" Jake felt something twist painfully in his chest. He'd hoped to handle this business matter quickly and quietly before Ellie woke up from her morning nap. The last thing he wanted was for his innocent daughter to witness the ugly realities of the world that had forced him into this situation. But there was no hiding from Ellie's penetrating questions or her pure heart that couldn't understand why anyone would make another person cry. She's just tired from the journey, sweetheart," Jake said, dismounting and trying to position himself between Ellie and the woman whose name he'd been told was Maria Santos. "Why don't you go inside and help Rosa with breakfast?" But Ellie, being 6 years old and possessed of the stubborn curiosity that ran in the Morrison family, wasn't about to be dismissed so easily. She stepped around her father and looked directly at Maria with the kind of unguarded compassion that adults spent their whole lives trying to recapture. "Hello," Ellie said simply, her small voice carrying across the morning air. "I'm Ellie. What's your name?" Maria Santos looked up for the first time since they'd arrived at the ranch, her dark brown eyes meeting those of the child who stood before her like a small angel. For a moment, something flickered in Maria's expression. Surprise, hope, a desperate kind of hunger for the basic human dignity that a simple question represented. "Maria," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying and dehydration. "My name is Maria." Jake watched this exchange with growing discomfort, knowing that every second his daughter spent talking to Maria made what he had to do next that much harder. He'd accepted the debt payment arrangement out of desperation. His ranch was 3 months behind on mortgage payments, and the bank was threatening foreclosure. When Carlos Hernandez had offered him Maria as collateral for a gambling debt, Jake had told himself it was just temporary, just until he could figure out a better solution. But looking at his daughter's face as she studied the shackles on Maria's wrists, Jake realized that some solutions came with a price that no amount of money could justify. "Daddy," Ellie said, her voice small and confused, "why does Maria have those metal things on her hands? Are they jewelry?" The innocence of the question hit Jake like a physical blow. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that sometimes adults did terrible things to each other? How do you tell your daughter that the man she looked up to as her hero had just become part of a system that treated human beings like property? "They're not jewelry, baby," Jake said quietly, kneeling down to Ellie's eye level. There's something that shouldn't be there." Ellie nodded seriously, as if filing this information away for future consideration. Then, with the kind of matter-of-fact determination that only children could muster, she turned back to Maria. "Don't worry," Ellie said, reaching out to gently touch Maria's shackled hand. "My daddy is the strongest man in all of Texas. He can break those off for you." In that moment, as Jake watched his daughter's small hand rest trustingly on the chains that bound Maria Santos, something fundamental shifted inside him. He'd thought he was solving a financial problem by accepting this arrangement. Instead, he'd created a moral crisis that his 6-year-old daughter had just forced him to confront. Maria was looking at Ellie with tears streaming down her face. But for the first time since Jake had collected her from Carlos Hernandez, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of something Jake hadn't expected to see: hope. Because sometimes it takes the pure heart of a child to show adults what they become and what they could choose to be instead. The rest of that morning passed like a fever dream for Jake Morrison. He'd settled Maria in the small storage room behind the kitchen, the only space in the house that had a lock on the outside, while trying to ignore the way his daughter's eyes followed his every movement with growing confusion and disappointment. Rosa, their elderly Mexican housekeeper, who'd been with the family since Jake's wife died 3 years ago, took one look at Maria's shackles and crossed herself, muttering prayers in rapid Spanish. But it was Ellie's silence that cut Jake to the bone. His normally chattering, curious daughter had grown quiet, her small face serious as she processed what she'd witnessed. "Daddy," Ellie said as Jake closed the storage room door, the sound of the lock clicking echoing through the kitchen like a gunshot. "Why did you lock Maria in there? Is she bad?" Jake knelt down beside his daughter, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to find words that would make sense to a 6-year-old mind. "No, sweetheart. Maria isn't bad. She's here because of grown-up problems. Business problems. But why does she have to be locked up if she's not bad?" Ellie's blue eyes, so much like her mother's, searched his face with the kind of penetrating innocence that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "And why was she crying, Daddy? Really? How do you explain to a child that sometimes good people do terrible things because they're desperate? How do you tell your daughter that the world isn't the fairy tale you've been pretending it is?" "Sometimes adults make mistakes, Ellie," Jake said finally, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Sometimes we do things we don't want to do because we don't see another choice." "But there's always another choice," Ellie said with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "That's what you taught me. You said even when things are hard, we can choose to be good." Jake felt something break inside his chest. Those were indeed his words. Lessons he'd taught his daughter about integrity and kindness, about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. Now those same words were being reflected back at him, like mirrors showing him exactly what he'd become. "You're right, baby girl," he whispered, pulling Ellie into a hug that felt like both confession and absolution. "You're absolutely right." That afternoon, while Ellie was supposed to be taking her nap, Jake found her sitting outside the storage room door, her small fingers pressed against the wooden planks as she whispered to Maria through the crack underneath. "My mama died when I was little," Ellie was saying, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet house. "But Daddy says she watches over me from heaven. Do you have someone watching over you, Maria?" Jake froze in the hallway, unable to bring himself to interrupt what was clearly a sacred moment between two souls recognizing each other's pain. "I had a little sister once," Maria's voice came through the door, soft and thick with emotion. "Her name was Carmen. She was about your age when bad men took us from our village." "Where is she now?" Ellie asked with the directness of childhood. There was a long pause before Maria answered. "She's with your mama now, mija. In heaven, where no bad men can hurt her anymore." Jake closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of what he'd become part of. This wasn't just about debt collection or financial arrangements. This was about human trafficking, about families torn apart by greed and violence. And somehow he'd allowed himself to become a link in that chain of suffering. "Maria," Ellie's voice continued, "when my daddy gets home from work, I'm going to ask him to take those metal things off your hands. They look like they hurt." "Mija," Maria said gently, "sometimes grown-ups can't do what children think they should do. Sometimes they have rules they have to follow, even when the rules are wrong." "But my daddy makes the rules here," Ellie said with absolute confidence. "This is our ranch. He can do anything he wants." That evening, after Rosa had served dinner and Ellie had been tucked into bed, Jake found himself standing outside the storage room door with a key ring in his hand and a decision weighing on his conscience like a lead blanket. He'd spent the afternoon reviewing his finances, looking for any alternative to the arrangement he'd made with Carlos Hernandez. The numbers were brutal. Without the money Hernandez had promised him for keeping Maria until she could be sold to buyers further north, Jake would lose the ranch within the month. Ellie would lose the only home she'd ever known, and Jake would lose the legacy he'd promised his dying wife he'd preserve for their daughter. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ellie's face as she'd asked about Maria's shackles. He heard his daughter's voice saying, "There's always another choice." Jake unlocked the door. Maria was sitting in the corner of the small room, her knees drawn up to her chest, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face. She looked up when he entered, and Jake saw something in her eyes he hadn't expected. Not fear exactly, but a kind of resigned wariness that spoke of someone who'd learned not to hope for mercy from men like him. "I brought you some food," Jake said awkwardly, setting down a plate of roses, beans, and cornbread. "And water." Maria nodded but didn't move to take the food. "Your daughter," she said quietly. "She has a beautiful heart." "She does," Jake agreed, settling down across from her in the small space. "Too beautiful for this world sometimes." "No," Maria said, her voice growing stronger. "The world needs hearts like hers. Hearts that ask why people are crying, and hearts that believe their fathers can break chains." Jake stared at her, seeing her clearly for the first time since he'd collected her from Hernandez. She wasn't just a debt payment or a financial arrangement. She was a young woman, probably no more than 25, with intelligent eyes and a dignity that even shackles couldn't diminish. She'd lost a sister to violence, had been torn from her family, and was now trapped in a nightmare of other people's making. And Jake Morrison was part of that nightmare. "Tell me about Carmen," he said suddenly. Maria's eyes widened with surprise. "What? Your sister? Tell me about her." For a moment, Maria just stared at him as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of trick. Then slowly, her expression softened. "She loved flowers," Maria said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Our village was in the mountains of Mexico, and every spring she would pick wildflowers and weave them into crowns. She said she was a princess of the flowers, and I was her queen." "How did you end up here?" Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Maria's smile faded. "Raiders came to our village 2 years ago. They said they were collecting debts, but really they were just taking people to sell. Carmen and I tried to hide, but—" She shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying more pain than words ever could. "They separated us at the first town. I never saw her again. And Hernandez, he bought me from the Raiders, said I would work in his cantina, serve drinks and clean. But that wasn't all he wanted." Maria's voice grew quiet. "When I refused his other demands, he said he would sell me to men who wouldn't ask for my permission." Jake felt sick. He'd known Carlos Hernandez was involved in unsavory business, but he'd told himself that was none of his concern. He'd needed the money, and he'd chosen not to ask too many questions about where it came from. "I'm sorry," Jake said, and meant it. "I'm sorry for what happened to you, and I'm sorry for my part in it." Maria looked at him with something like surprise. "You are? My daughter asked me today why you were locked up if you weren't bad," Jake said. "I didn't have a good answer for her." "Because there isn't one." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of truth settling between them like something tangible. "What will happen to me?" Maria asked finally. Jake looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a debt payment or a business arrangement, but a human being who deserved the same basic dignity and freedom that he took for granted every day. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I know what should happen. You should be free. But—" Jake pulled the key to her shackles from his pocket, turning it over in his hands as he wrestled with a decision that would either save his daughter's future or damn his own soul. "But nothing," he said finally, reaching for the iron cuffs around Maria's wrists. "My daughter is right. There's always another choice." As the shackles fell away from Maria's wrists, leaving red welts that would heal but memories that never would, Jake Morrison made the first truly moral decision he'd made in months. He just hoped it wouldn't be the last decision he ever got to make as a free man. The trouble began 3 days after Jake had removed Maria's shackles, and it came in the form of Carlos Hernandez riding up to the Morrison ranch with 2 armed men and a face like a thundercloud. Jake had been expecting this confrontation, but that didn't make the cold fear settling in his stomach any easier to bear. Ellie was in the kitchen with Maria, the two of them making tortillas under Rosa's watchful eye. A scene so domestic and peaceful that Jake almost couldn't believe the violence that was about to shatter it. "Morrison!" Hernandez's voice carried across the yard like a whip crack. "We need to talk. Now." Jake stepped out onto the porch, his rifle within easy reach but not openly displayed. He'd learned long ago that showing fear to men like Hernandez was like showing blood to sharks. "Carlos," Jake said evenly, "what brings you out to my ranch?" Hernandez dismounted, his silver spurs jangling, as he approached the porch with the swagger of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. His two companions remained mounted, their hands resting casually near their weapons. "You know damn well why I'm here," Hernandez snarled. "My property has been seen walking around your ranch without proper restraints. The woman was supposed to be kept secure until the buyers arrive from El Paso next week." "Maria Santos is not your property," Jake said quietly. "She's a human being." Hernandez laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Human being? Morrison, you're even more naive than I thought. That woman is merchandise, paid for, owned, and scheduled for delivery, and you've been interfering with a legitimate business transaction." From inside the house came the sound of Ellie's laughter, bright and innocent, followed by Maria's softer response. The contrast between that joy and the evil being discussed on the porch hit Jake like a physical blow. "There's nothing legitimate about slavery, Hernandez." "Slavery?" Carlos's eyes narrowed dangerously. "That's a mighty serious accusation, Morrison, especially coming from a man who agreed to the arrangement when he needed money to save his precious ranch." The truth of that statement hit Jake harder than any fist could have. He had agreed to it. He had been complicit in this horror, and now that he was trying to extract himself from the situation, Hernandez was making it clear that escape wouldn't be easy. "I made a mistake," Jake said. "I'm correcting it." "The only thing you're going to correct is your attitude." Hernandez stepped closer to the porch, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You have until sunrise tomorrow to have that woman properly restrained and ready for transport. If you don't, there will be consequences that extend far beyond your financial difficulties." One of Hernandez's men shifted in his saddle, his coat falling open just enough to reveal the badge of a deputy sheriff pinned to his vest. Jake's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. Hernandez had law enforcement in his pocket, which meant that if this escalated to violence, Jake would be painted as the criminal. "You threatening me, Carlos?" "I'm explaining reality to you." Hernandez's smile was like a blade. "You see, if something were to happen to you, an unfortunate accident perhaps, your ranch would go up for auction to pay your debts. And I happen to know several interested buyers who would be willing to pay top dollar for this land. Your daughter would need somewhere to live, of course. I'm sure suitable arrangements could be made." The implied threat to Ellie sent white-hot rage flooding through Jake's veins, but he forced himself to remain calm. Losing his temper now would only give Hernandez an excuse to escalate the situation. "You're talking about kidnapping a child." "I'm talking about providing for an orphan," Hernandez replied smoothly. "Though I suppose that's only a concern if her father makes poor decisions about his business obligations." Before Jake could respond, the screen door opened behind him and Ellie stepped out onto the porch, her small face bright with flour dust and happiness. "Daddy! Maria taught me how to make the tortillas round instead of—" She stopped mid-sentence as she noticed the strange men, her instincts immediately picking up on the tension in the air. "Who are they, Daddy?" Hernandez's attention fixed on Ellie with the intensity of a predator spotting prey, and Jake felt every protective instinct in his body screaming at him to put himself between his daughter and this monster. "Well, well," Hernandez said, his voice taking on a false sweetness that made Jake's skin crawl. "This must be the famous Ellie I've heard so much about. What a pretty little girl." Ellie moved closer to her father, her small hand slipping into his as she studied the strangers, with the careful wariness that children developed when they sensed adult danger. "Ellie, go back inside with Rosa," Jake said quietly, never taking his eyes off Hernandez. But before Ellie could move, Maria appeared in the doorway behind her, and Jake watched Hernandez's expression transform from false pleasantness to something darker and hungrier. "There she is," Hernandez said, his voice dropping back to its normal predatory tone. "Looking much healthier than when she left my care. I trust you've been treating my property well, Morrison." Maria's face went pale, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she placed her hands protectively on Ellie's shoulders, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by any of the men watching. "I'm not your property anymore," Maria said, her voice steady despite the fear Jake could see in her eyes. "Mr. Morrison freed me." Hernandez laughed. "Freed you?" "Morrison doesn't have the authority to free anyone. He's just a debtor who made an arrangement he now wants to back out of." Ellie looked up at her father, confusion clear in her blue eyes. Daddy, what does he mean? What arrangement? This was the moment Jake had been dreading, the moment when his daughter would learn that her hero father wasn't the man she thought he was. Sometimes, sweetheart, Jake said carefully, grown-ups make deals that they later realize are wrong. I made a deal with Mr. Hernandez that I shouldn't have made. What kind of deal? Ellie's voice was small, but her grip on his hand was fierce. Before Jake could answer, Hernandez spoke up with cruel satisfaction. Your father agreed to keep Maria locked up until I could sell her to some men who wanted to buy her, like a horse or a cow. The horror that crossed Ellie's face was like a knife to Jake's heart. He watched his daughter process this information, saw the moment when her faith in him cracked and began to crumble. But Daddy, Ellie whispered, you said people aren't things. You said they can't be bought and sold. You're right, baby girl. People can't be bought and sold. That's why I'm not going through with the deal. Hernandez's patience finally snapped. Enough of this nonsense. Maria, get in the wagon, now. No, Maria said firmly, pulling Ellie closer to her. I won't go with you. You don't have a choice. Yes, she does, Ellie said suddenly, her small voice carrying clearly across the yard. This is America. People get to choose where they live and who they live with. We learned that in school. Hernandez stared down at the 6-year-old who had just defied him with the moral clarity that adults spent lifetimes trying to achieve. For a moment, he seemed genuinely taken aback by the child's courage. Then his expression hardened into something truly ugly. Little girl, he said, his voice dripping with menace, you don't understand the situation here. Your father owes me money, and Maria is how he's going to pay it. If he doesn't honor our agreement, very bad things are going to happen to everyone on this ranch. Ellie Morrison was only 6 years old, but she possessed the kind of moral courage that some adults never found. Looking up at the man who was threatening her family, she spoke with the absolute certainty of someone who had never learned to doubt that good should triumph over evil. My daddy will protect us, she said simply, and if you try to hurt Maria, he'll stop you. Because that's what good daddies do. They protect people. Hernandez's face flushed with rage at being lectured by a child. His hand moved toward his gun, and Jake tensed, ready to throw himself between his daughter and any threat. But before violence could erupt, Rosa appeared in the doorway behind them, her ancient shotgun cradled in her arms, and her weathered face set in lines of absolute determination. Senor Hernandez, she said quietly, I think you should leave now. Before someone gets hurt. Hernandez looked around the porch, taking in Jake's protective stance, Rosa's shotgun, Maria's defiant expression, and Ellie's unwavering faith in her father's goodness. He was outnumbered, and more importantly, he was on Jake's land, surrounded by people who would fight to protect each other. This isn't over, Morrison, he said, backing toward his horse. You have until dawn tomorrow to reconsider. After that, we'll be back with more men and legal papers that will make this conversation much shorter. As Hernandez and his men rode away, Jake knelt down beside his daughter and looked into eyes that still held faith in him despite everything she'd learned. Ellie, he said softly, I need you to know that I made a terrible mistake. But I'm going to fix it, no matter what it costs. Ellie studied his face with the serious expression of someone far older than her years. Then she wrapped her small arms around his neck and whispered in his ear, I know, Daddy, because you're good, and good people always find a way to do the right thing, even when it's scary. Looking over his daughter's shoulder at Maria, who was watching them with tears in her eyes, Jake Morrison realized that he was about to risk everything he owned to keep a promise he'd made to a 6-year-old's unwavering faith in his goodness. And for the first time in years, that felt like a bargain he was willing to make. That night, as darkness settled over the Morrison ranch like a heavy blanket, Jake found himself sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, and a decision weighing on his conscience that would determine the fate of everyone he loved. Maria sat across from him, her fingers wrapped around her own untouched cup, while Rosa bustled around the kitchen with the nervous energy of someone preparing for war. Ellie had finally been coaxed to bed, but not before extracting a promise from her father that Maria would still be there when she woke up. A promise I might not be able to keep, Jake thought grimly. You should let me go, Maria said quietly, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the kitchen. If I leave now, tonight, Hernandez will follow me and leave you and Ellie alone. Jake looked up from his coffee, seeing the resignation in Maria's dark eyes, the same look he'd seen in cornered animals who'd given up fighting for their freedom. "And where would you go?" he asked. "How far do you think you'd get on foot in country you don't know, with no money and no weapons?" "Far enough, maybe. Long enough for you to keep your ranch and your daughters safe." Rosa snorted from where she was loading her shotgun shells. "Mija, you think that cabron Hernandez will just forget about this? You think he'll let Senor Jake go unpunished for defying him?" "Rosa's right," Jake said. "Hernandez doesn't strike me as the forgiving type. If you run, he'll hunt you down, and then he'll come back here for revenge. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about him maintaining his reputation as a man who doesn't tolerate defiance." Maria's shoulders sagged with the weight of understanding. "Then what do we do? He has men, guns, money, even corrupt lawmen. We have each other," came a small voice from the kitchen doorway. All three adults turned to see Ellie standing there in her white nightgown, her blonde hair tousled from sleep, and her blue eyes bright with determination. "Ellie, sweetheart, you should be in bed," Jake started, but his daughter held up a small hand to stop him. "I heard you talking," she said, padding across the kitchen floor in bare feet to climb onto Jake's lap. "And I want to help." "Baby girl, this is grown-up business." "No, it's not," Ellie interrupted with the stubborn certainty that ran in the Morrison family. "It's about Maria being part of our family now. And families protect each other. Families." The word hit Jake like a revelation. When had Maria Santos gone from being a debt payment arrangement to being part of their family? When had this frightened, shackled woman become someone his daughter considered worth fighting for? Looking at Maria's face as Ellie spoke, Jake saw the exact moment when hope rekindled in her eyes. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to false promises, but the steady, warming hope of someone who had found people worth believing in. "Mija," Maria said softly, "your daddy is right. This is very dangerous. Bad men are coming, and we'll be ready for them," Ellie said with absolute confidence. "Won't we, Daddy?" Jake looked down at his daughter, this fierce little warrior who believed without question that good people could overcome evil if they just tried hard enough. Then he looked at Maria, who'd lost a sister to monsters like Hernandez, but was still willing to sacrifice herself to protect the family that had shown her kindness. Finally, he looked at Rosa, who'd been loading shotgun shells with the grim efficiency of someone who'd fought this kind of battle before. In that moment, Jake Morrison realized that his daughter was right. They weren't just three adults and a child facing impossible odds. They were a family, and families had a power that men like Hernandez could never understand. "Yes, baby girl," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "We'll be ready for them." The next few hours were spent in careful preparation. Jake cleaned and loaded every weapon on the ranch, while Rosa inventoried their ammunition and food supplies. Maria, it turned out, had skills that none of them had expected. She knew how to set snares and traps from her childhood in the mountains, and her knowledge of Hernandez's men and methods proved invaluable. "Miguel and Santos, they are coward," she explained, as she helped Jake position furniture to create defensive barriers in the house. "They will run at the first sign of real fight. But Diego, the one with the deputy badge, he is different. He likes hurting people. He will not stop until someone stops him. Then we'll stop him," Jake said simply. As dawn approached, Jake sent Rosa to take Ellie to the root cellar beneath the house, a hiding place that could be sealed from the inside and had a tunnel that led to the barn in case escape became necessary. "But I want to help fight," Ellie protested, her lower lip jutting out in a pout that would have been adorable under different circumstances. "You are helping," Jake explained, kneeling down to look her in the eyes. "You're helping by staying safe, so I don't have to worry about protecting you while I'm protecting Maria. Can you be brave for me and Maria?" Ellie considered this seriously, then nodded. "I can be brave, but Daddy?" "Yes, sweetheart. Promise me you'll protect Maria. Promise me you won't let the bad men take her away." Jake looked into his daughter's trusting eyes and made a vow that he knew might cost him everything he owned, everything he'd built, possibly even his life. "I promise, baby girl, I promise." The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky with soft pink light when the sound of approaching horses announced that Hernandez had returned, and this time he hadn't come alone. Jake counted at least 8 riders, all armed, all looking like men who made their living through violence and intimidation. "Morrison!" Hernandez's voice carried clearly across the morning air. "Time's up! Send the woman out, and maybe we can still settle this like civilized men." Jake stepped out onto the porch, his rifle cradled in his arms, his face set in lines of grim determination. Behind him, he could feel Maria's presence at the window, could sense her fear, but also her resolve. "The only thing we need to settle is your departure from my land, Hernandez." "Your land?" Hernandez laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You mean the land that's 3 months behind on mortgage payments? The land that the bank is about to foreclose on? That land?" Jake felt ice form in his stomach. Hernandez had done his research, knew exactly how desperate Jake's financial situation was. "I know all about your troubles, Morrison. I know the bank's already started legal proceedings. I know you've got maybe 2 weeks before you lose everything." Hernandez's voice took on the smooth, reasonable tone of a snake oil salesman. "But I'm a generous man. Honor our original agreement, and I'll pay off your mortgage myself. You can keep your ranch, keep your daughter safe, and all it costs you is one Mexican girl who was never really yours to begin with." The offer hung in the air like poison, tempting and terrible at the same time. Jake could save everything he'd worked for, secure Ellie's future, eliminate all his financial problems with one simple choice. All he had to do was betray the woman who'd become part of their family. From inside the house, he heard Ellie's voice calling out from the root cellar, muffled by distance and floorboards, but clear enough for him to understand. "Remember your promise, Daddy?" And just like that, the temptation crumbled to dust. "No deal, Hernandez," Jake called back. "Maria Santos is under my protection, and she's staying under my protection." "Then you've chosen to die for her." "No," Jake said, his voice carrying across the yard with absolute certainty. "I've chosen to live for her, and for my daughter, and for the kind of man I want to be when this is all over." Hernandez's false reasonableness finally cracked, revealing the monster beneath. "Kill them all," he screamed, "but bring me the woman alive." The first gunshot shattered the morning silence, and Jake Morrison dove for cover behind a wooden support beam as bullets began splintering the air around him. The war for Maria Santos' freedom had begun, and Jake knew that before it was over, he would either prove to his daughter that good people really could triumph over evil, or die trying to become the hero she believed him to be. From the window behind him, Maria's voice rang out clear and strong. "Vamos a luchar. We're going to fight." And for the first time since this nightmare began, Jake Morrison smiled. The gunfight that erupted at dawn on the Morrison Ranch would be talked about in Texas for generations, but not for the reasons anyone expected. It wasn't the number of bullets fired or the tactical brilliance of the combatants that made it legendary. It was the moment when a 6-year-old girl proved that sometimes the smallest people can make the biggest difference. Jake had taken position behind the thick wooden beam that supported the porch roof, his Winchester rifle speaking with deadly accuracy as Hernandez's men spread out to surround the house. 2 of them were already down, their horses running riderless across the prairie, but that still left 6 professional killers against 1 rancher, 1 elderly housekeeper, and 1 woman who'd been a captive just days before. Those weren't exactly favorable odds, but Jake Morrison had something his enemies didn't. He was fighting for family. Maria had positioned herself at the upstairs window, using Jake's old Spencer rifle with a precision that surprised everyone, including herself. Growing up in the mountains of Mexico, her father had taught her to hunt deer and wild turkey, but she'd never imagined she'd be hunting men who wanted to drag her back into slavery. "Miguel is moving toward the barn," she called down to Jake, her voice steady despite the bullets whining past the window frame. "Santos is trying to circle around from the east side." "Rosa!" Jake shouted toward the kitchen. "Cover the back door." The elderly housekeeper's shotgun boomed in response, followed by a stream of Spanish curses that would have made a sailor blush. Rosa might have been 70 years old, but she'd raised 5 sons and buried 2 husbands, and she wasn't about to let some criminals terrorize her adopted family. But even as Jake's small group fought with the desperation of people protecting everything they held dear, he could see they were being overwhelmed. Hernandez was directing his men with military precision, using their superior numbers to press the attack from multiple directions simultaneously. "Morrison!" Hernandez's voice carried across the gunfire. "This is your last chance. Send out the woman and we'll let you and the old lady live." Jake's answer was a bullet that passed close enough to Hernandez's ear to part his hair. The criminal leader dove for cover behind his horse, cursing in 3 languages. From the root cellar beneath the house, Ellie Morrison was listening to the battle raging above her head and doing something that none of the adults had expected. She was thinking like a 6-year-old, which meant she was thinking creatively. The tunnel that connected the root cellar to the barn had been dug by Jake's grandfather during Indian raids 40 years ago, and it had saved the Morrison family before. Ellie knew every inch of that tunnel, had played in it countless times despite her father's warnings to stay out. Now, as she listened to the gunfire and her family fighting for their lives, Ellie Morrison decided that maybe it was time to stop being a good girl and start being a hero. She slipped out of the root cellar through the tunnel, emerging in the barn just as Miguel was taking position behind a hay bale, preparing to fire on her father from behind. Ellie had never hurt anyone in her life, but she'd spent enough time around horses to know that even the gentlest animals could be dangerous when startled. Thunder, Jake's prize stallion, was a 17-hand black horse with a temperament that matched his name. He was also directly behind Miguel, separated only by the gate of his stall. With the fearless logic that only children possessed, Ellie Morrison opened Thunder's stall door and slapped the stallion hard on his hindquarters. Thunder exploded from his stall like a force of nature, his iron-shod hooves striking sparks from the barn floor as he charged toward the nearest exit, which happened to be directly through Miguel's position. The gunman had just enough time to look up and see 2,000 pounds of enraged horseflesh bearing down on him before Thunder's shoulder sent him flying into a support post with enough force to end his participation in the fight permanently. "One down," Ellie whispered to herself, then crept toward the barn's side door to see where else she might be able to help. Outside, Jake heard the commotion in the barn and allowed himself a grim smile. He didn't know exactly what had happened, but Miguel's rifle had gone silent, which meant the odds were slowly tilting in their favor. Maria had eliminated Santos with a shot that would have made her father proud, leaving his body crumpled behind the water trough where he'd tried to set up a flanking position. Rosa's shotgun had discouraged 2 more of Hernandez's men from approaching the house, though they were still pinned down behind various pieces of cover. But it was Diego, the corrupt deputy sheriff, who presented the most dangerous threat. Unlike the others, he wasn't content to engage in a long-range gunfight. Diego was working his way closer to the house with the patience of a professional killer, using every scrap of cover to advance until he could breach the building and end the fight at close quarters. Jake spotted him just as Diego reached the corner of the house, his badge glinting in the morning sun like a mockery of justice. The deputy had his pistol drawn and was preparing to kick in the back door when a small voice spoke up behind him. "Mister, you're not supposed to be here." Diego spun around to find himself face to face with Ellie Morrison, who stood in the yard holding a bucket of chicken feed and looking at him with the kind of serious disapproval that only children could muster. "Little girl," Diego snarled, "you need to get out of here before you get hurt." "I'm not going anywhere," Ellie said firmly. "This is my house, and you're not invited." Diego looked down at the 6-year-old who was defying him and felt something snap in his brain. He'd killed men twice her father's size without hesitation, had terrorized entire towns into submission, had built his reputation on being the kind of man who showed no mercy to anyone who crossed him. But somehow, this blonde-haired child was looking at him like he was nothing more than a bully who needed to be scolded. "You know what, kid?" Diego said, his voice taking on the cold, dead tone that meant he'd decided someone was going to die. "Maybe it's time you learned what happens to people who don't show proper respect." He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Ellie's chest. What happened next would be debated in saloons and church socials for decades afterward. Some said it was divine intervention. Others claimed it was just luck. But Jake Morrison, watching from the porch as a corrupt lawman prepared to murder his daughter, knew exactly what it was. It was Maria Santos proving that love could make anyone into a warrior. Maria had seen Diego threatening Ellie from her upstairs window, but she was too far away for an accurate shot with the Spencer rifle. So she did something that no one, least of all Diego, expected. She came through the upstairs window in a controlled fall that brought her down on Diego's back like an avenging angel. The deputy's shot went wild as Maria's weight drove him to his knees, his pistol flying from his hand as he tried to shake off the woman who was clinging to him with desperate strength. He outweighed her by 60 pounds and had 20 years of experience in violence. But Maria Santos had something he didn't understand. She was fighting for a little girl who'd shown her kindness in a world full of cruelty. "Get away from her!" Maria screamed, her fingers clawing at Diego's eyes as he tried to buck her off his back. "Don't you touch that child!" Diego managed to throw Maria off, sending her rolling across the dusty ground. But by then, Jake was already moving. He vaulted over the porch railing and covered the distance to Diego in 3 long strides, his rifle butt connecting with the deputy's skull with a sound like an axe hitting wood. Diego dropped like a fallen tree, his badge finally reflecting the justice he'd spent years perverting. "Ellie!" Jake scooped his daughter up in his arms, his hands shaking as he checked her for injuries. "Baby girl, are you hurt? What were you doing out here?" "I was helping Thunder help us," Ellie said matter-of-factly, as if releasing enraged stallions was a perfectly normal part of her daily routine. "And I wanted to tell the bad man he wasn't invited to our house." Jake looked over at Maria, who was pulling herself to her feet with Rosa's help, her dress torn and her face scratched, but her eyes blazing with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd found a family worth dying for. In that moment, Jake Morrison realized that his daughter had been right all along. There really was always another choice, and sometimes that choice was to fight for love instead of surrender to evil. The remaining members of Hernandez's gang, seeing their leader's best men dead or unconscious, began to lose their enthusiasm for the fight. It was one thing to terrorize isolated ranchers with superior numbers, but it was quite another to face people who fought like they had nothing left to lose and everything worth saving. "This ain't worth dying for," one of them called out to Hernandez. "Let's get out of here before the real law shows up." But Carlos Hernandez wasn't ready to admit defeat. He'd built his reputation on never backing down, never letting anyone defy him without paying a terrible price. The idea that a broken-down rancher, an old woman, and a Mexican girl could humiliate him in front of his own men was intolerable. "Nobody leaves until that woman is in chains," he screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "I don't care if we have to burn down the whole ranch." As if in response to his threat, the sound of approaching horses could be heard from the direction of town. But these weren't more of Hernandez's reinforcements. Sheriff Tom Bradley was leading a posse of 12 men, all of them respectable citizens of the county who'd grown tired of Hernandez's illegal activities. Behind them rode Judge Harrison Walsh, whose presence meant that whatever happened next would have the full weight of legal authority behind it. "Carlos Hernandez," Sheriff Bradley's voice carried easily across the ranch yard, "you're under arrest for human trafficking, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Surrender now and maybe you'll live to see trial." Hernandez looked around wildly, seeing his remaining men already throwing down their weapons and raising their hands in surrender. His empire of fear and cruelty was crumbling around him, brought down by a rancher who'd chosen love over money and a little girl who'd refused to let evil win. "This isn't over, Morrison!" Hernandez screamed as the sheriff's men surrounded him. "I'll find a way to make you pay for this." But Jake Morrison, standing on his porch with his daughter in his arms and Maria at his side, no longer feared men like Carlos Hernandez. He learned something important about himself in the past few days. When you're fighting for family, when you're protecting people you love, you discover reserves of courage you never knew you had. "Yes, it is over," Jake called back as the sheriff snapped handcuffs on Hernandez's wrists. "It's over, and love won." As the last of the criminals were led away in chains, Ellie Morrison looked up at her father with eyes shining with pride and happiness. "Daddy," she said, "you kept your promise. You protected Maria." "We all protected each other, baby girl," Jake replied, pulling Maria into their embrace as Rosa joined them on the porch, her shotgun finally silent. That's what families do. 3 weeks after the gunfight that would become legend, Jake Morrison stood in the same kitchen where he'd once locked Maria in a storage room, watching her teach Ellie how to braid wildflowers into crowns, while sunlight streamed through windows that no longer needed bars or locks. The transformation was remarkable, not just in Maria, who'd gone from terrified captive to confident member of their family, but in the ranch itself. Word of their stand against Hernandez had spread throughout Texas, and the Morrison Ranch had become something of a pilgrimage site for people who believed that good could triumph over evil when backed by courage and love. But it was the smaller, quieter changes that meant the most to Jake. Maria no longer flinched when men approached her. She laughed freely at Ellie's jokes and had begun teaching Rosa traditional Mexican recipes that filled the house with the warm sense of home and belonging. Most importantly, she'd started talking about the future, instead of just surviving the present. "Like this, mija," Maria said, showing Ellie how to weave a daisy stem through the crown of wildflowers. "My sister Carmen taught me this when we were little. She said every flower crown needed one white flower for hope." "What do the other colors mean?" Ellie asked, her small fingers working carefully with the delicate stems. "Red for love, yellow for friendship, purple for courage." Maria's voice carried the warmth of someone sharing precious memories instead of painful ones. "And green for new beginnings." Jake watched from the doorway as his daughter absorbed this lesson in both flower weaving and life philosophy, marveling at how seamlessly Maria had stepped into the role of teacher, protector, and beloved family member. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his thoughts, but instead of reaching for his rifle as he might have 3 weeks ago, Jake simply glanced out the window to see who was coming to visit. Sheriff Bradley was riding up the path, but this time he wasn't leading a posse or chasing criminals. Behind him rode Judge Walsh and, surprisingly, Father Miguel from the Catholic Church in town, a combination that suggested official business of a different sort entirely. "Jake," Sheriff Bradley called out as he dismounted. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." "Just family time," Jake replied, stepping out onto the porch. "What brings you boys out to my ranch?" Judge Walsh, a dignified man in his 60s who'd presided over more trials than he cared to count, removed his hat and looked around the ranch with obvious approval. "Well, Jake, we've got some official business to discuss, and Father Miguel here has a proposal that I think you'll find interesting." Father Miguel stepped forward, his kind eyes twinkling with something that looked suspiciously like matchmaking mischief. "Senor Morrison, I've been hearing wonderful stories about your family from everyone in town. Stories about courage, about love conquering evil, about people choosing to do what's right even when it's difficult. Maria and Ellie deserve the credit for that, Father. I just learned to listen to them." "Ah, but listening is often the hardest part," the priest replied with a knowing smile. "Which brings me to why I'm here. I've spoken with Judge Walsh, and we've prepared some documents that we think might be of interest to you and Senorita Santos." Judge Walsh pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebag and handed it to Jake. "Official adoption papers for Maria Santos, making her a legal citizen of Texas, and, more importantly, officially making her part of your family. Her testimony against Hernandez and his organization has been invaluable to our investigation, and the territorial government wants to show its appreciation." Jake stared at the papers, feeling the weight of official recognition for what his heart had known for weeks. Maria Santos belonged here, belonged with them, belonged to their family in every way that mattered. "There's more," Father Miguel added gently. "If certain people were interested in making their family bonds even more official, the church would be honored to perform a marriage ceremony. Not that I'm suggesting anything, of course, but I did happen to notice the way you two look at each other when you think no one is watching." Before Jake could respond, Ellie came bursting through the screen door, her flower crown slightly askew and her face bright with excitement. "Daddy! Maria, come quick! Rosa says there are important people here." She skidded to a stop when she saw the 3 visitors, then executed a perfect curtsy that would have made her late mother proud. "Hello, Mr. Sheriff. Hello, Mr. Judge. Hello, Father Miguel." "Well, hello there, Miss Ellie," Judge Walsh said with genuine warmth. "We were just talking to your father about some legal matters concerning your family." Ellie's eyes widened with interest. "What kind of legal matters? Are we in trouble?" "No, mija," Father Miguel laughed. "Quite the opposite. We're here to make sure your family is properly official in the eyes of both the law and the church. You mean Maria can stay forever? Really, truly forever? If that's what everyone wants, Judge Walsh confirmed. Ellie's squeal of delight could probably be heard 3 counties away. She launched herself at Jake's legs, hugging him with enough force to nearly knock him over. Daddy, this is the best day ever. Can we have a party? Can Maria wear a pretty dress? Can I be the flower girl? Slow down there, baby girl, Jake laughed, but his heart was soaring. We need to ask Maria what she wants first. As if summoned by her name, Maria appeared in the doorway, her hair adorned with the wildflower crown she and Ellie had been making. She looked beautiful, confident, and completely at home, exactly the opposite of the terrified, shackled woman Jake had brought to this ranch weeks ago. What's all the excitement about? She asked, then noticed the official visitors and the papers in Jake's hands. Her expression grew cautious, and Jake realized she was afraid the government was here to take her away after all. Maria, Jake said gently, Judge Walsh has brought adoption papers. Legal documents that would make you officially part of our family, with all the rights and protections that come with being a Texas citizen. Maria's hand flew to her mouth, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. I can stay? Really stay? No one can take me away? No one can take you away, Jake confirmed. You're home, Maria. This is your home. We're your family. And that's official now. But Father Miguel wasn't finished yet. And if certain people were interested in making their commitment to each other even more official, he said with a meaningful look at Jake and Maria, the church stands ready to perform a marriage ceremony that would unite not just 2 hearts, but officially create the family that already exists in spirit. The silence that followed was broken by Ellie's practical, 6-year-old logic. Well, of course they're going to get married, she announced matter-of-factly. Daddy loves Maria, and Maria loves Daddy, and I need a mama. It's obvious. Maria looked at Jake, her dark eyes shining with tears and hope and something deeper. Is it obvious to you too? She asked softly. Jake set the legal papers aside and took Maria's hand in his, looking into the face of the woman who transformed his life and his daughter's life simply by being brave enough to trust them with her heart. Maria Santos, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, you came into our lives in chains, but you've given us more freedom and joy than we ever dreamed possible. You've shown my daughter what it means to be strong and courageous, and you've shown me what it means to love someone with everything you have. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice when you chose to trust us? Maria's answer came not in words, but in the kiss she gave him, right there on the front porch in front of God, the law, and a 6-year-old girl who clapped her hands and cheered as if her favorite fairy tale was finally getting its happy ending. I take that as a yes, Father Miguel chuckled. Shall we say 3 weeks for the ceremony? That should give us time to properly prepare and let word spread to everyone who'll want to witness this union. 3 weeks, Jake agreed, never taking his eyes off Maria's face. Can I pick out my dress? Ellie demanded. Can I pick out Maria's dress too? Can we have dancing? Can thunder be in the wedding? We'll see about thunder, Jake laughed, but yes to everything else. As the official visitors prepared to leave, Judge Walsh pulled Jake aside for a private word. You know, Jake, there's been talk in town about needing a new deputy sheriff, someone who's proven they can stand up to corruption and protect innocent people, someone who understands that the law should serve justice, not the other way around. The position comes with a good salary and a house in town, though I suspect you might prefer to stay out here on your ranch. Jake looked around at his land, his home, his family, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Thanks for the offer, Judge, but I think I've found my calling right here. Besides, Maria's talking about starting a school for the children in the area, and Ellie's going to need proper schooling soon, and we've got plenty to keep us busy. That evening, as the sun set over the Texas prairie, the Morrison family sat on their front porch, Jake in his rocking chair, Maria in the chair he'd built for his late wife. Ellie cross-legged on the porch floor with her flower crown still perfectly positioned on her blonde head. Daddy, Ellie said suddenly, remember when I asked you why Maria was crying? I remember, baby girl. She's not crying anymore. Now she smiles all the time, and she laughs, and she teaches me things, and she hugs me when I have bad dreams." Ellie looked up at her father with the wisdom of someone far older than 6. "I think you did a good job breaking those chains." Jake looked at Maria, who was watching the sunset with the peaceful expression of someone who'd finally found where she belonged. "We all did a good job, sweetheart," he said. "We all helped break those chains." And as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake Morrison realized that his daughter had been right all along. A child's love really could break the chains that men made, whether those chains were made of iron or fear or desperation. 3 weeks later, the Morrison Ranch would host the biggest wedding in Texas history, with guests traveling from 3 counties to witness the union of a rancher who'd chosen love over money and a woman who'd proven that freedom was worth fighting for. But that night, sitting on their porch under the vast Texas sky, they were already complete. A family forged not by blood or law, but by the simple decision to choose love over fear, courage over safety, and each other over everything else the world had to offer. The chains were broken, and they would never be forged again. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect Texas sky that made people believe in divine providence. The Morrison Ranch had been transformed into something magical. White ribbons fluttered from fence posts, wildflowers grew in carefully tended gardens, and a makeshift altar stood beneath the old oak tree where Jake's grandparents had been married 40 years before. By sunrise, people were already arriving from 3 counties away. Ranchers and shopkeepers, teachers and preachers, families who'd heard the story of the child's love that broke the chains and wanted to witness the happy ending with their own eyes. Even some of the cowboys who'd worked for Jake over the years had ridden in from distant ranches, grinning and slapping their old boss on the back as they marveled at the transformation in both him and his bride-to-be. But it was Ellie Morrison who truly stole the show that day. She'd appointed herself the official wedding coordinator, directing the placement of flowers with the authority of a general commanding troops, and ensuring that every detail met her exacting 6-year-old standards. She wore a dress of pale yellow cotton that Rosa had sewn specially for the occasion, with wildflowers woven through her blonde curls and a smile that could have powered the entire state of Texas. "Daddy," she announced as Jake struggled with his tie in front of the mirror Rosa had propped up in the kitchen. "Maria looks like a princess, but she's crying again. But this time it's the good kind of crying." Jake's hand stilled on his collar. "She's crying? Is something wrong?" "No, silly," Ellie giggled. "She's crying because she's happy." Rosa explained it to me. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're too happy to keep all the feelings inside their hearts. Jake understood that feeling completely. Over the past few weeks, as he'd watched Maria bloom from a terrified captive into a confident woman who laughed freely and sang lullabies to Ellie at bedtime, he'd sometimes felt so full of gratitude and love that his chest could barely contain it all. "Is she ready?" he asked. Though what he really wanted to know was whether she was having second thoughts about marrying a man who'd once held her prisoner, even briefly. "She's ready," Ellie said with absolute certainty. "And Daddy? She told me something special." "What's that, baby girl?" "She said that today isn't just about you two getting married. It's about all of us becoming official family. She said I'm going to be her daughter too, really and truly, and that means Carmen is watching from heaven, and she's happy because Maria found a new little sister to love." Jake knelt down and pulled his daughter into a fierce hug, overwhelmed by the generosity of the woman who was about to become his wife. Maria hadn't just accepted Ellie as part of their union. She'd embraced her as the sister her lost Carmen could never be, completing a circle of love that had been broken by violence and restored by courage. "I love you, Ellie Morrison," he whispered into her hair, "and I'm so proud of the brave, kind, wonderful little girl you are." "I love you too, Daddy. Now come on, everyone's waiting." The ceremony itself was simple but perfect. Father Miguel, resplendent in his best robes, spoke about love conquering fear, about families being built by choice rather than blood, and about the miraculous power of children to show adults what really mattered in life. When Maria appeared at the back of the gathered crowd, walking slowly toward the altar with Rosa on one arm and Sheriff Bradley on the other, Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. She wore a dress of white cotton and lace that the women of the town had sewn together, each contributing a piece of fabric or trim so that the entire community was literally woven into her wedding gown. Her dark hair was crowned with the same wildflowers Ellie wore, and her face glowed with a joy so pure and radiant that several of the watching women began to cry along with her. But it was her eyes that made Jake's heart stop. Eyes that had once held only fear and despair, now sparkled with love, hope, and the absolute certainty of someone who had finally found her home. Dearly beloved, Father Miguel began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, we gather here today to witness a miracle. Not the miracle of two people falling in love, though that is indeed miraculous, but the miracle of a child's pure heart showing adults how to choose love over fear, courage over safety, and family over everything else the world has to offer. Ellie, standing beside them as maid of honor, beamed with pride at being mentioned in the ceremony. She held Maria's bouquet of wildflowers with the solemnity of someone entrusted with the crown jewels. Jake Morrison, Father Miguel continued, do you take Maria Santos to be your wife, to love and protect, to honor and cherish, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Jake said, his voice strong and clear. And I promise to spend every day proving that she made the right choice when she chose to trust us with her heart. Maria Santos, the priest turned to the bride, do you take Jake Morrison to be your husband, to love and support, to honor and cherish, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Maria replied, her voice ringing with joy. And I promise to love not just Jake, but Ellie and this community that showed me what home really means. As Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, the entire crowd erupted in cheers and applause. But before Jake could kiss his bride, Ellie tugged on Maria's dress and whispered something in her ear. Maria laughed, that free, joyful sound that had become Jake's favorite music, and lifted Ellie up into their embrace. What did she say? Jake asked, grinning as he looked at his two favorite people in the world. She said, Maria replied, that now we're all official family, and the bad dreams can never come back because we'll always protect each other. The celebration that followed would be talked about in Texas for generations. There was dancing under the stars, with Thunder and the other ranch horses decorated with ribbons, and watching the proceedings with the dignified interest of family members. There was food enough to feed an army, with every family contributing their best dishes, and Rosa supervising the whole operation like the general she was. But perhaps most importantly, there were stories. Stories of courage, of love, of the power of choosing to do what's right even when it's difficult. And at the center of all those stories was a 6-year-old girl who had asked the right questions at the right time and changed the course of 3 lives forever. 25 years later, Ellie Morrison Walsh would stand in front of her own daughter's school class, telling the story of how her family came to be. By then, she was a teacher like her stepmother Maria had been, and she'd learned the power of stories to shape young hearts and minds. Children, she would say, this is a true story about how my daddy learned that there's always another choice, even when it seems like there isn't. It's about how my mama Maria showed us that broken chains can never be forged again. But most of all, it's about how sometimes the smallest people can make the biggest difference just by asking the right questions and refusing to accept that cruelty has to win. A little boy in the front row, because there's always a little boy in the front row, would raise his hand and ask, Miss Ellie, what was the most important question you ever asked? And Ellie would smile, remembering a morning long ago when she saw her father bringing home a woman in chains and felt her heart break at the sight of another person's tears. The most important question I ever asked, she would say, was, Daddy, why is she crying? Because that question led to all the other questions, and all those questions led to the most wonderful family anyone could ask for. Back on that perfect wedding day in 1882, as Jake and Maria and Ellie sat on their front porch long after the last guest had gone home, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the peaceful sounds of their ranch settling into sleep, none of them knew about the decades of happiness that lay ahead. They didn't know about the school Maria would build, or the dozens of children she would teach, or the way their story would inspire other people to choose love, over fear. They didn't know about the grandchildren who would play in the same yard where thunder had once charged through, or the great-grandchildren who would tend the wildflower garden that Maria planted in Carmen's memory. What they knew was simpler and more profound. They knew they belonged to each other, completely and forever. "Daddy," Ellie said sleepily, curled up in Jake's lap while Maria leaned against his shoulder. "Are you happy?" "Happier than I ever thought possible, baby girl." "Good," Ellie yawned, "because tomorrow we start our real life as a family." Jake looked down at his daughter, then at his wife, then up at the vast Texas sky full of stars and possibilities. "Actually, sweetheart," he said softly, "I think our real life started the day you asked me why Maria was crying. Everything else has just been us learning how to live up to the love you showed us that day." And under the endless Texas sky, surrounded by the people they loved most in the world, the Morrison family began the next chapter of their story. A story that would prove, again and again, that a child's love really could break any chains that men dared to forge. The end was really just the beginning. And so ends the remarkable true story of Jake Morrison, Maria Santos, and little Ellie Morrison. A tale that proves the most powerful force in the world isn't money, violence, or fear, but the pure heart of a child who refuses to accept that cruelty must win. History would remember the Morrison family not for the wealth they accumulated or the land they owned, but for the moment they chose love over profit and proved that families aren't just born. They're forged by courage, commitment, and the decision to protect each other no matter the cost. Jake Morrison became one of the most respected ranchers in Texas, but his greatest accomplishment wasn't his successful cattle operation or his financial recovery. It was raising a daughter who grew up believing that the right question at the right time could change the world, and proving to his wife every single day that her trust in him had been worth the risk. Maria Santos Morrison transformed from a woman in chains to one of Texas's most beloved educators, founding schools throughout the frontier territories and teaching hundreds of children that their circumstances didn't define their futures. Her approach to education, always asking, "Why is someone hurting?" instead of, "Why are they causing trouble?" became the foundation for a new understanding of childhood development that influenced teachers across America. Ellie Morrison grew up to become a federal judge, carrying forward the lessons her parents had taught her about the difference between law and justice. She was known throughout her career for asking the one question that other judges often forgot: who is this decision really helping? Her courtroom became famous as a place where the powerful couldn't hide behind money or influence, and where the powerless always found someone willing to listen to their stories. The story of their love spread far beyond the Texas prairie, becoming one of the most retold tales of the American frontier. It reminded people that heroes don't always wear badges or carry guns. Sometimes they're 6-year-old girls who ask uncomfortable questions, or women who find strength in the darkest moments, or men who discover that their greatest victory comes not from conquering others, but from conquering their own fears. But perhaps most importantly, this story serves as a reminder that the choice between good and evil isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as a child asking, "Why is she crying?" and an adult deciding that question deserves an honest answer. Sometimes it's choosing to see a human being instead of a business arrangement, or deciding that your daughter's respect matters more than your financial security. In our modern world, we still face moments when we can choose to walk past someone else's suffering or stop to ask why they're hurting. We still encounter situations where doing the right thing costs more than we want to pay, where protecting the innocent requires us to risk our own comfort and security. Jake Morrison's story reminds us that these moments define who we are far more than our achievements or possessions ever could. Every day, we can choose to be the kind of person who breaks chains instead of forging them, who asks questions instead of making assumptions, who sees families where others see strangers. The Morrison family ranch still stands in Texas today, now run by Maria's great-great-granddaughter, who keeps wildflowers growing in Carmen's memory and tells visitors the story of how a child's simple question changed 3 lives forever. Above the front door hangs a small wooden sign with words that Ellie carved when she was 16. "Home is where love breaks the chains." This is the legacy of the American frontier, not just the violence and struggle that filled newspaper headlines, but the quiet moments when ordinary people chose extraordinary love and proved that the strongest chains in the world are no match for a family determined to protect each other. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more incredible tales of courage, love, and the power of choosing what's right over what's easy. Like this video if Jake, Maria, and Ellie's journey touched your heart. Comment below. What's the most important question a child has ever asked you? How did it change your perspective? Remember, sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages. Listen to them.